My name is Cleve Scott, and it's my pleasure to welcome you. Live from Camden Park in St. Vincent. Camden Park is a small development just outside of the capital, Kingston. And this session is to present the results of a research finding by colleagues at the Cleve campus of the University of the West Indies. The Cleve campus is one of the 5 campuses of the University of the West Indies. We also have St. Augustine in Trinidad and Tobago, Mona in Jamaica, 5 Islands in Antigua, and the open campus, which is virtual with landed presence in the various territories. Also with us this evening are collaborators from a project entitled The Visible Crown in the Caribbean. And we will hear also from Assistant Professor of History at the University College of London, Quinn. And later on, we would hear from the key researchers for this project, Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles, Professor of Constitutional and Political Matters, as well as Professor Devonish, who is in Management Studies. I'll first call on Assistant Professor Quinn to tell you a little bit about this project and the involvement of our collaborators in the UK at the University College of London and at City University. Over to you, Professor Quinn.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here tonight. So my role this afternoon is just to introduce the larger project, which is called The Visible Crown, Queen Elizabeth II and the Caribbean 1952 to the present, under the umbrella of which this poll was carried out. The Visible Crown is a large collaborative research project which is funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council in the UK, and drawing together researchers and project partners from the UK and the Caribbean. The principal investigator is Professor Anna Whitelock of City University, who sends her apologies for today's event. And she's joined by the team at UEK Hill, Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles and Dr. Cleve Scott, and by myself at UCL, Philip Murphy at the University of London, Alice Hunt at Southampton, and Grace Carrington at City and UCL. So this project has been in the making for a very long time. We submitted the funding application, I think way back at the beginning of 2020. And in fact, before Barbados had officially announced that it would transition to republic status. So when that announcement came, of course, it made the project all the more relevant and more urgent. The overall aim of the project is to understand the constitutional, political, and cultural significance of the Queen in the Commonwealth Caribbean across the nearly 70 years of her reign. So why, for example, has the connection with the Crown in the region proved so enduring, with 8 out of the 12 Commonwealth Caribbean countries retaining the Queen as head of state? Until Barbados became a republic this year, the last Caribbean country to cut ties with the Crown was Dominica in 1978. So how do we explain this apparent constitutional inertia? And is that likely to change in the wake of the historic events in Barbados? What is the future of the Crown in the Caribbean? So to address some of these questions and put them into historical perspective, the project has 2 main strands, one that's constitutional and political, and one that's cultural. So the constitutional political strand looks at how the presence of the Crown or the monarch is made manifest in Caribbean constitutions, in political and legal structures and institutions, and with what effects. So that's things like the role of the Governor General, oaths of allegiance to Her Majesty, her heirs and successors, as the phrase goes, the honour system, the retention of the Privy Council, and so on. It also looks at past and present debates around constitutional reform And where proposals to change the relationship with the crown have been put to a referendum, for example, why have these not succeeded? The issue of reparations and how monarchy features in reparations demands is another key area of interest here. The cultural strand is interested in how the presence of the crown and the monarchy has featured in Caribbean culture. And that could be anything from the rituals and the regalia of national ceremonies to the presence of images and symbols of the Queen in everyday material culture, such as banknotes, post boxes, stamps, coins, portraits, and memorabilia, to representations of royalty in popular cultural forms, such as, for example, calypso. Some of you may recall the Mighty Sparrow's calypso, Philip, My Dear, from 1982, with its satirical take on a man breaking into the Queen's bedroom in Buckingham Palace. One of the key focuses of the cultural strand is the royal tour, that moment when the crown as an institution and the Queen as a person is made physically visible in Caribbean spaces. And my colleagues Anna Whitelock at City and Alice Hunt at Southampton are going to be looking at all the royal tours across the period. So that's the visits of the Queen in 1953, 66, 77, 85, and 2002, which is the last time that the Queen visited the region, and also more recent visits, such as that by Prince Harry in 2016, looking at both the performative and the soft power function of monarchy, and also the local debates that were generated around these visits. So one thing the project is interested in is gathering people's memories of those tours. Were you pulled out of school, for example, to go and watch the Queen go past? Or did you, as some of the people I've spoken to did, stay indoors as an act of protest? An important oral history element of the project is therefore to capture some of these memories. And that's going to be conducted actually by our moderator tonight, Dr. Cleve Scott and his team. And lastly, that brings us to the poll. So I won't preempt my colleagues here who are going to be speaking on the poll this afternoon, but just to say that a critical part of the research is to try to gauge contemporary attitudes to the monarchy, to the Queen, and to republicanism across the whole of the Commonwealth Caribbean. And this is the work being conducted by Professor Barrow-Giles and Professor Devonish at UWE Cave Hill, starting with Barbados for obvious reasons, and then working across the Caribbean, which will provide for the very first time, I believe, a comparative snapshot of attitudes across the whole region. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the results from the Barbados poll today, and also to hear some of the views of the audience. So I'll end here, hand back to Cleve, and thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much, Professor Quinn. At this point, I would like to extend apologies on behalf of the Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at Cave Hill, Professor Troy Lord, who can't be with us this evening, but extends his greetings and congratulations. As you are aware, two of our panelists, Professor Professor Barrow-Giles and Professor Devonish are in the Faculty of Social Sciences, although they are in different departments. And I am in the Faculty of Humanities. So this initiative and this entire research project is an example of interdisciplinary research. Just to indicate to you, Professor Quinn, that Sparrow had two bites of the cherries. Yes, Philip, my dear, and don't forget Red Plastic Bag with his Elizabeth Come. At this point, I want to invite Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles, recently promoted, and we congratulate her. And also, she was recently awarded by the Vice Chancellor for extensive work in the public service across the Caribbean. For those of you who don't know, Professor Barrow-Giles was in Guyana during the political impasse over the election. She led that team. So outstanding work there from her. And Professor Devonish has been doing outstanding research work. I wonder sometimes where he gets the time from, doing extensive polling and surveys in Barbados and elsewhere in the Caribbean. So we congratulate them and we thank them for coming on board on this research project. So I'll hand over to Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles.
Thank you very much, Cleve, and welcome to our audience, both on Facebook and of course on this Zoom link. Dwayne, if you could take us through the slides, I'd appreciate it. Okay, so I'm just going to start off the presentation by essentially just outlining what we intend to do with you this afternoon. And thereafter, I will ask Professor Devonish to take us through the beginning of the presentation of some of our key findings. Principally, he'll be speaking of the issue of the public sentiments about constitutional monarchy versus the parliamentary republic. Thereafter, I'll return to discuss our findings on the role, people's perception on the role of the Queen, and of course, by extension, since we are talking about the crown, we are therefore talking about the entire royal family. When that is completed, we are going to look at people's perception of the benefits and of course what they perceive to be disadvantages of both constitutional monarchy and of course the parliamentary republic, which Barbados is now. After that, we are going to speak to the issue of whether or not the public is adequately or sufficiently aware of those political issues and of course the implications stemming from that. And I will conclude thereafter and we'll open up to, of course, the panelists. So you've heard Kate, what we're first going to do, go back please, Dwayne, what we are first going to do, and Kate has done some of that for us, thankfully, is to just give a background to the project, this project. We are going to look at the objectives of this particular project. At least I'm going to look at that, and then Dwayne is going to look at the methodology and the data collection, as well as to give you or provide you with a profile of the participants. And after that, as I indicated, we will do the presentation of key findings. All right, now, in relation to the background to the project, Dwayne, as Kate indicated, the project is about the role of the Queen in the Commonwealth Caribbean, as Kate indicated, from 1952 to the present moment. And of course, it will extend beyond 2021. So as Kate also indicated, what we are going to try to do with respect to the cross-national survey is to compare the constitutional significance of the Queen across the Caribbean. But as again, Kate indicated, is much broader than that, because we're also going to look at, in terms of the entire project, on the cultural significance of the project. We know that next year, the Queen, if she survives 2021, hopefully, will be celebrating her Platinum Jubilee. And the history, we believe, of her reign in the Caribbean, the English-speaking Caribbean, since decolonization is therefore warranted. We do not believe that, in fact, this has been done as yet. And so in terms of the entire project, there are three main questions that occupies the mind of all of the researchers. And the first, of course, is what has been the precise constitutional role for the Queen in relation to all of the English-speaking Caribbean. When I talk about all of the English-speaking Caribbean countries, I'm not only referring to those countries, of course, who moved to independence, but also the British overseas dependencies. And as you know, there are quite a number of Caribbean territories which have still not declared or achieved their independence. So we also want to judge what is taking place there as well. And so the research is going to seek to capture that as well. The second major objective of the entire project is to see what kind of visible and symbolic presence the Queen, and by extension, the rest of the royal family, has, of course, in each of the Caribbean countries, independent and non-independent. And again, I think Kate dealt with that quite well. And finally, in terms of the third main question, a line of inquiry that the project seeks to unearth and to pursue is basically how do Caribbean people feel? How do they feel about the Queen and the royal family by extension, and whether or not there has been any changes over time in relation to the perceptions of the Queen and of course, the family. As we indicated with respect to this presentation today and what we are doing in relation to the cross-national survey, this is the first leg, and as Quinn indicated, obviously, for obvious reasons, because we wanted to capture the perceptions of Barbadians as Barbados was about to transit to the Republic. And what we're therefore going to do thereafter is to seek to duplicate this particular survey with some minor adjustments, of course, to the other remaining jurisdictions in the Caribbean. Next slide, please. So in terms of the key project objectives, and I'm talking about the national survey, this national public opinion survey was really commissioned to examine the views, the preferences and perceptions of citizens of Barbados. And it is not on everything in relation to the Republic. I assume a number of people might feel this is about republicanism per se, but it's not. It is much broader than that. And as Kate indicated, it's really about perceptions and attitudes towards the monarchy and also therefore the Queen. So we are going to try to capture, we have sought to capture the perceptions of citizens of Barbados on a number of key issues related to the perception of the monarchy in the Caribbean. And of course, where Barbados is concerned is related primarily to how Barbadians feel about the monarchy here. Of course, how they feel perhaps about the constitutional monarchy in Barbados and the decision to transit to a republic. So primarily when we look at this particular project, we are going to explore essentially the views and perceptions of Barbadians beyond just their views on the monarchy. We are going to explore the perceptions of Barbadians in relation to the decision of the Barbados government to transit to the Republic. But we are not only interested in the views of Barbadians in relation to the transit to the Republic. I want to make that absolutely clear. Next slide. Okay, Professor Devonish will take you through the methodology that was applied and issues related to data collection. And then he's also going to look at the demographic background of the respondents and then begin to focus on some of the key findings in terms of the survey.
Thank you, Cynthia. And let me also welcome all participants on our Zoom and Facebook Live platforms. Okay, so in relation to the methodology that we decided to adopt, now the pandemic had really discouraged the use of face-to-face modality where we would have hired enumerators to go to households to conduct interviews with residents across the board. So we had to be a bit more creative. And what we actually did was to employ an electronic representation of the survey using PC tablets and even mobile devices. And these were actually under the ownership of 5 enumerators, which we had trained extensively before the execution of the survey. So we had 5 enumerators and we stationed those 5 enumerators across the 11 parishes. And this is all virtual, of course. What we would have used or leveraged in our sampling would have been the directories. We had listings and directories of householders across Barbados, and we were able to kind of conduct an assignment of the segments of the Barbadian population across those 5 enumerators. Now, the targeted sample size was 500 residents, and we thought that, you know, managing the budget that we had, especially, and of course, recognizing that we wanted a representative sample, and 500 is really within that particular ceiling. When you look at many polls out there, because 5% margin of error, you typically would go for 400 participants or residents, given the population size of Barbados. So 500 residents was the main target choice here. Now, there were clear instructions given to these enumerators in the way that they target residents across Barbados, across the 11 parishes. There were instructions regarding the number of residents of a household. So for example, no more than one resident from the same household would be surveyed. That was very clear. And we also allowed enumerators to rely on virtual interviewing and telephone methods. So they were making calls to these residents and not having a physical or face-to-face modality in place, of course, because of the pandemic and the risks that we wanted to mitigate. Now, when it came to the virtual interviewing, that was leveraged either through a Zoom interview or a WhatsApp interview between an enumerator and a selected participant. Now, the data collection span for this project, as we would have indicated earlier, this survey would have been employed prior to the Republican transition in Barbados. So between the 23rd of October and the 10th of November this year, we were able to collect these 500, in fact, more than 500 residents at the end of the day. This is actually a diagrammatical cross-section of what the sample looks like. Across the 11 parishes, you can see in the rows, so there you can see that demographic breakdown by male and female. You get an idea of how that sample spread was, which of course was representative. This was based on some recent data that we managed to obtain from the Barbados Statistical Service in terms of a stratification of the population. Now, I would like to speak to the outcome of our results in terms of the demographic profile. Now, we successfully surveyed 513 respondents. And you can see here as a sex demographic, we had about roughly 50% female, 49%. So that was roughly equal proportions of male and female in the population. Don't be deceived by the heights of the bar. I think that's the way that the actual diagram was pasted, but that was a roughly equal distribution of male and female. Typically our sample, you can see here when it comes to age, the age demographic, we had between the 18 to 24, the 25 to 34, and the 35 to 44, in fact, up to the 45 to 54, a bit more presence in those age groups. So the younger middle age groups here, when it kind of tapers off in the 55 years plus, you'll see 12.5% each roughly for 55 to 64 age group and the 65 plus. Now, when it came to highest level of completed education, we've seen here that in this survey that 44% of our participants had tertiary level education at the highest level, and we had 30%, that was followed by 30% in the technical vocational segment, and of course 24% roughly high secondary school education at the highest level of attainment. So predominantly we had kind of a highly educated sample. Employment status, again, I think consistent with many other surveys, 52% of our population employed working full-time. The 15.4%, which would pretty much carry that to about 67, close to 70%, then of our population being employed full-time or part-time, essentially. There 10.8% or roughly 11% not employed looking for work. And then those who are not employed, not looking for work, because there's a major distinction between the two, 1.8%. So 11% of our sample really not employed looking for work, as opposed to a roughly 70% or so who are employed full-time and part-time. Okay, so I'm going to present on the first portion of these findings, notably looking at the public sentiments about constitutional monarchy versus the parliamentary Republican status that we've now transitioned to as a country. Now, let me again repeat, these results emerge before the transit from the constitutional monarchy to the Republican status. Okay, so this is important to note. Now, let's get into the meat of this. Do you support Barbados becoming a republic or remaining as it is now as a constitutional monarchy? So prior to our transition on November 30th, we were able to survey over these 500 respondents. And what we found, interestingly, that 1 in 3 Barbadians were ready to be supportive of Barbados being a republic. Now, there are things that you have to consider, and I think these things will come out in our discussion in the Q&A section especially. But when we look at this data, you can clearly see that the 34%, 1 in 3, is not necessarily an absolute majority, because it doesn't hold more than half of the sample, but is indeed a relative majority. So a relative majority suggests that you have a predominant category in a sense, relative to the other categories, like supporting Barbados as a constitutional monarchy. If you look at that bar, that's at 15%. So that's actually half that proportion, roughly. So you can see that there's that predominant sentiment for a Republican status. Now, interestingly, I would like you to also focus, and we'll probably have more discussion on this, the option of either I'm satisfied with Barbados as either a republic or monarchy. I'm fine, it's fine for me. If you look at that middle bar, you're having a competitive 30% there, roughly, of Barbadians who are pretty much indifferent in a sense that whether Barbados remains a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, or if it moves to Republican, it's fine for them. So that's something to note. Now, we asked a follow-up question. Do you think Barbados should keep the Queen as the head of state, or should it have its own elected/selected head or president? Now, even though we might argue that, it should be sufficient to find out whether Barbadians are happy to become a republic, we wanted to drill down to find out exactly how they feel about having their own president or head of state. Now, you can see there's a stronger sentiment when it comes to these types of issues, because you can see here 50%. That's more. No, we can say that's absolute majority. That's 51% roughly. If we round that up, 51% of our sample actually indicated yes, we want an elected or selected head or president in the country. Okay, so that if you contrast that against the 34%, 35%, you can see clearly where Barbadians' views were headed. Now, just after that, within the same survey, within the same question, you can see here that there's a stark contrast in terms of the percentages, because in the absolute majority with over 51%, you can see the remaining 49% or so are split across the Queen as the head of state, for example. That was only garnered 12%, okay, at best. So you can see there it's not a popular sentiment for Barbados to have to have the Queen being retained as the head of state. Now, as all statistics, we would like to delve deeper into the demographic profile. So you were just shown the percentage of Barbadians, about 35% of Barbadians who opted for a Republican status. And we want to see how that demographic behaved. What kind of demographic do we have? So let's look at the age demographic there. So when it comes to support, and if you can see this clearly, and this was quite interesting, from 18 to 24, 30%, that's 31% roughly, if you round it up to the next whole number. About 31% of the youngest age category, listen carefully to this, relative to 46% of the oldest category, 65 plus, that we've surveyed. You can see that there's a stark difference there. And it's quite interesting, because when you look at the surveys that were done recently for Canada, Australia, there were a number of polls done in terms of support for Republican status for those territories. You would have seen that older people typically are more supportive of the monarchy in a sense, and that you would expect younger people, and you would see that in surveys in other countries, that younger people are a bit more, far more supportive of the move to Republican status. Here, you're seeing from this survey, interestingly, that is kind of in the reverse. You're saying that 46%, that's close to half of the oldest category of people, are actually more in favor of, or more supportive of, the Republican move or transit, as opposed to the younger group of people. And of course, these are things that would be up for discussion at the end of this presentation. But one would have to wonder then, what is the makeup of these 65 plus? Are they the more educated persons? Are they persons who are more inclined to think that Barbados would benefit most from the transition than younger people? Or is it that younger people are uninterested? Are they indifferent? And hence, that's why the support is not there. So that is something that we can go further to have a discussion around. Now, so let's look at having what I call a comprehensive demographic profile of those who are in support of the Republican move, and of course having their own head of state. So when we delve deeper in the statistics of the survey, your typical supporter or advocate for Republican status tended to be older, yes, older, more educated, in fact, at least tertiary educated. And even though there was no difference between males and females when it came to the question about whether they support the Republican move, there was a sex difference. In a sense, males had a slightly higher preference of having our own head versus the queen. And this, I don't think this was in no way different from other surveys in across territories where there was a constitutional monarchy, in the sense that females were a bit more accepting and supportive of the monarchy than males in other countries. So here in Barbados, even though, so I want you to understand the difference here, even though that males are slightly more likely to say that, you know, we want our own head of state relative to females, I still want you to understand that when we ask the question about whether you support a Republican move or transition for Barbados, that there was no sex difference. The difference only came out when we spoke about, or we asked the question about whether they think that we should either have a queen or retain the queen at that time, or move to having our own head of state. So that was quite interesting. Again, these are things that we can submit for discussion further. Now, let's look at educational level in a bit more detail. As I said, you know, the more educated Barbadian tended to be more supportive. Now, this seems to be consistent with other surveys and elsewhere, especially in Canada, where you have more educated Canadians be a bit more supportive towards the move to a republic than less educated. And we are saying the same thing here. If you look carefully at the statistics, 37% of those with primary education, and when you add secondary education, that's 25%. Pretty low relative to what you're seeing in the higher group of the tertiary educated Barbadian, typical college or university educated Barbadian. So clearly there's that positive correlation between education and support for the Republican move. Now, I want to go back to the age support dynamic. I've made a few mentions of earlier surveys where, you know, it was typical for older residents in those territories to be more supportive of the constitution, their own constitutional monarchy, and less supportive of the republic, and younger people being more supportive of the Republican move. I wanted to kind of provide some context though for our survey here, because even though our results would deviate from other surveys like what we've seen in Canada and UK recently, even in 2021, those recent polls, when we drill down in our survey data analysis, trying to understand why is it that younger people were less supportive, or older people being more supportive to the Republican move, we realized that the majority of our older people in this sample, this 500 sample, actually more than 65% of them were actually more educated. In fact, they represented a higher proportion of the tertiary educated segment. And that's clear. So you see, we can't look at it as a kind of a one-dimensional way, just because you're older, that you have this kind of romanticizing and sentimentality towards the monarchy. You have to consider the fact that older Barbadian comes with other dimensions. So older Barbadian can very well come with higher levels of education, which can overshadow that age difference that you would typically see in other surveys. So that's important to note, to add context, that those older people were more educated Barbadians than the younger people that we captured in this survey. And here's another thing to add to context. The younger people who, remember, who we said were less supportive relative to their older counterparts, we actually delved deeper and realized that those younger people were quite unfamiliar of the two political systems, the constitutional monarchy in general and the parliamentary Republican status. And, you know, it would clearly open up the question whether younger people were really informed, and perhaps that older people were much more informed of these political systems and what they actually mean for the country. So those were things that we have to consider. When you're looking at statistics, you have to delve deeper in terms of the context, all right? But again, what we deduced at the end of the day was that knowledge of political systems, having that advanced knowledge of political systems and what they are and what they mean to a population, and of course, coupled with one's educational background, both of these seem to be critical determinants to supporting the transition irrespective of age. So I wouldn't want us to consider the fact that by being over 65, for example, by being over the age of 65, that you automatically support the move of Republican, and that's all it is. But that is a multidimensional thing that you have to consider. The fact that you're older, you have a greater knowledge of political system, and that then coupled with a higher educational background would go a longer way for your support for transition to occur, and not looking at age in and of itself. Okay, so those are what we call confounding factors that play a role in support, and not necessarily the age factor itself. Now, as I said earlier, you know, there was no sex difference there was no sex difference in terms of the support of Republic. When you look at the results between male and female, in particular, you can see very close percentages. 36% of males roughly support the Barbados being a republic, and that's contrasted against 34%. So no serious or significant sex difference in terms of support. But remember that question: do you think that Barbados should keep the Queen as the head of state, or should it have its own elected president? There was a clear distinction in the percentage here. So you can see here that 55%, so males were a bit more aggressive here, saying yes, we should have our own head of state or our own president, either elected or selected. And relative to the 46% of females, I mean, roughly about 10% difference, but it was found to be significant, statistically speaking. And again, this was no different from many of these surveys done even in the UK and Australia, and even recently in Canada, where females were, relative to males, were a bit more accepting of the monarchy, and especially the status of the royal family and its influence, generally speaking. Okay, so I am going to segue to Professor Barrow-Giles to provide now her presentation on the next segment of this survey, and this is looking at the public views on the role of the Queen and the royal family.
Thank you, Dwayne. Yes, as I indicated at the beginning of the presentation, we were particularly concerned about the perceptions of the royals, the perception of the Queen, and by extension, the other members of the royal family. So over the next few minutes, I'm going to deal with the public perception of not just the Queen, but the better known royals. If we look, what we'll see is we asked the Barbadians in the survey whether or not they believe that the Queen was important for Barbados. And the results indicated that roughly just over, so a majority of those respondents to the question indicated that the Queen they did not see the Queen as having an important role for the country. It's not that they disliked the Queen, but they did not see a major political or other significance of the Queen in the Caribbean. We move beyond that, if you can move on, Dwayne. We move beyond that to ask a very direct question as to what were their views in relation to the presumptive heir to the throne. And that is, of course, Prince Charles, who is her likely successor. And the results here are quite telling. What we see is that an absolute majority felt that Prince Charles, they did not care for Prince Charles in relation to being the head of state of Barbados at nearly 57%. There are only a very small percentage of those we actually interviewed who indicated that, in fact, they saw him as a likely successor, as someone who was important to Barbados. But that is just about 12% of the 513 persons that we, in fact, interviewed. So most Barbadians, therefore, said no to the hypothetical king. And that is, in fact, consistent with sentiments in other Commonwealth realms. For instance, Dwayne kept making reference to a recent survey, as recent as, I think, last month. I think it was last month in Canada, where, yes, a November 2021 survey showed that whereas 55% of Canadians, for instance, are satisfied with the current arrangements with Queen Elizabeth at the helm of the political system in Canada, only 12% actually supported mid-12% supported Prince Charles here. And we get a similar sort of picture in Canada. And I think, therefore, that is in fact quite significant. But beyond just the Queen and Prince Charles, we also wanted to get a sense of how Barbadians felt about the rest of the royal family. And when we talk about the rest of the royal family, we are speaking specifically about the most better known members of the royal family. And we went back some ways, as you could see. We asked them their views on persons like Princess Margaret, Prince Philip, who had recently died, of course, Princess Anne, Prince Andrew, even went back as far as Princess Alice. And of course, we also raised the issue of Prince William and Prince Harry. When you look at this particular chart, what you'll see is that Prince Harry, no longer Prince, I think, receives or did receive the relative majority support of Barbadians, with some 41% of those people we interviewed being favorably disposed towards Harry. For most of the other royals, the favorability factor really ranged from 10%, for instance, Prince Andrew, who was the least favored of all the royals, to 16%, which is in fact Prince William. So what we saw from that is that clearly Harry is almost 3 times more popular than his brother Prince William, who presumably will in fact follow his father, you know, in the event something happens to Prince Charles. So here you get a 41% compared to a 16%, which is reflected for William. Most Barbadians, therefore, in terms of this particular question, were either not interested, if you look at the statistics here, were either not interested, or they were in fact unable to respond to the specific question on what was their view in relation to Princess Margaret, or, you know, Princess Anne, or Princess Alice, for instance. So we can, of course, assume that they were generally unfamiliar with the royal family And for me, therefore, what it means is that what it indicates is that there might be diminishing importance of the monarchy or the crown to the lives of ordinary Barbadians. For sure, the royals are not held in high esteem when you look at the results that we see in here. It also does not escape us. At least I don't think it is escape Dwayne and myself, that Prince Andrew has the lowest favorability liking. And we, of course, simply assume that this is somehow related to the negative media coverage of his behavior and the scandals concerning his relationship with the disgraced Epstein. And that is how, in fact, we view the less than 10% likability factor for Prince Andrew. Next slide. So those who view the monarch as unimportant to Barbados, and therefore that includes the other members of the royal family. Overall, when we looked at the data, what we saw, and that is consistent with, of course, what Dwayne was indicating a while ago, what we saw is that the older people tended to view the royals as unimportant to the country when compared, of course, to the younger cohort of those people that we interviewed. In addition to that, again, is consistent all the time. It is those people who were some 55% of the sample population who had tertiary level education tended to, again, have a more shaded, less favorable response to the monarchy. And again, that can be compared to what we saw in relation to those persons who had lower level type education. Either they had gone to secondary school or they had not even gone to secondary school. We also saw that as well in relation to the clear differences between those who were employed and unemployed in relation to their views on the monarchy. So again, the majority, and it's at 50%, is not an absolute majority, but certainly 50% of the employed and retired had a sort of a negative view of the monarchy when compared to, of course, the unemployed sector of the respondents. Now, in terms of the age and the perception of the Queen and the royal family, essentially what we saw coming from here is that among all the age groups, what we see is that the support, there's a strong level of support for removing the crown in our political system. That's consistent again with what Dwayne was discussing a while ago from among the older population. And we see here it is from those persons who are 55 to 64%, for instance. This is at 53%, and those who are 65 and above at nearly 57%, and that can be compared to persons who are between the ages of 18 to 24. Again, that is consistent throughout the questions that we ask the respondents. The next slide, please. We also see, of course, in terms of the education, we try to assess the extent to which education, again, consistent with what Dwayne was suggesting a while ago, whether or not that was connected to the perception of the Queen as being relatively unimportant to Barbados. And so what we're seeing is that education appears to be a good predictor of support for a non-monarchical system of government for the country, with roughly 56% of persons with post-secondary and tertiary level education supporting some form of a Republican system of government for Barbados. If you could move on, please, Dwayne. In terms of the employment, we're also seeing a similar picture again here with some 56%, 57% of retired individuals. And of course, here, those who are employed and working, some 57%, do not perceive the Queen as being important in relation to her role in the political system of Barbados. Next slide. Now, in terms of the public perception of the pros and cons of constitutional monarchy for Barbados and the parliamentary republic, The data is in fact quite interesting, and it leads us to make, I think, some important recommendations going forward. We know that in 2022, going into 2023, there will be a lot of discussions taking place on the Constitution and further changes. I imagine it may have some impact in relation to the decision to transit to a parliamentary republic, given some of the suggestions that are coming from the respondents. But we did ask respondents how they felt about whether or not Barbados had benefited having the Queen and the Governor General as a representative, as the head of state of Barbados. And a relative majority, some 38%, said no, there were actually no benefits that Barbados had, tangible or otherwise, that Barbados had gained from having the Queen as its head of state. There were those, of course, yes, 30% said yes, there were some benefits. But those who perceived the actual benefits were more likely to support the retention of the monarchy than those who did not see, of course, benefits to the Queen being the head of state of Barbados. Next slide. We asked the respondents further whether or not they believe that the transition to a republic would impact Barbados, and in what way it would impact Barbados. And what we see here is that the majority, the absolute majority of the respondents, nearly 66% of them, was sort of very neutral on the issue. They were not very clear. They were not, I would say, enthusiastic in relation to whether or not it would either have a negative or positive impact on Barbados. So they're sort of neutral in that way. But what we do see is that 21% of those we actually interviewed felt that there would be a positive impact on the transition, to Republic of Barbados. And I think that is in fact important. There are implications coming out of that 65% or 66%, and we will discuss them now or when it comes to either, potentially any questions that we may be raised by you, our audience. So next slide, please. Now, what is the relationship between the perceived positive or negative impact of the transition and the actual level of support for the transition? What we saw in terms of when we look at the results of the poll, is that the support for the transition was positively related to the perceived gains or losses from the transition to a parliamentary republic. Because what the data is saying to us is that the majority of Barbadians, some 74% to 83%, who believe that moving to a republic would be positive for Barbados, actually supported the transition. And similarly, what we saw is that the majority of persons, but lower, 53% to 71%, who believe that moving to a republic would have negative implications for Barbados, disapproved of the transition. And that is why we could conclude that the support is positively related to perceived gains or losses, perceived losses from the transition to a parliamentary republic. Next slide. All right, now we asked them, when we asked we asked specifically for the respondents to indicate what were those advantages and what were the disadvantages that they perceived. And what we saw was that given the responses that received or the lack of responses, that is very clear that people were giving us some off-the-fly responses and that there was indeed a knowledge gap. That knowledge gap was very evident. In terms of those who indicated that there would be benefits, more than 89%, when we asked them to identify what those benefits were, nearly 90% of them were unsure, but they knew that there would be benefits. And when we asked them to clarify in relation to what they saw as disadvantages, moving to the Republic, again, 80% of them were unsure. They were unable to provide us with anything that was concrete. And we put that down to a lack of political knowledge, a lack of knowledge about the existing political systems, even if they were indicating that they supported on in the one hand, or they in fact disapproved of what was taking place there. Again, in terms of the respondents on the issue of the Republican status, it showed the same thing in relation to the monarchy. More than 50% of the responses simply suggested some sort of generic, they gave us some generic responses, and that is, we can now chart our country's own path without being specific. What it is that suggested to us that under monarchical system of government, we were not able to chart our own path. And secondly, they also suggested that we'll be completely free from the United Kingdom, as if we have not already been free from the United Kingdom. And that is the positive. And in terms of the disadvantages, some 60% of the responses said there were none, and the others were in fact unsure. And we'll again put that down to unfamiliarity, what we call the knowledge gap that in fact clearly exists. Now, we're going to look at the public awareness and general perceptions and suggestions in relation to proposals on the Republic. And almost a third of the sample population, that is 31%, just about 2% shy of that to 1/3, were generally in fact unfamiliar with the Republican system, because we asked them specifically whether or not they're familiar with the Republic, with a system of government in which the Queen, through the Governor General, is actually head of state. And that is technically the model that we operated in Barbados prior to, of course, November the 30th. And what we saw was quite stark, that in fact, about 11% of them were not at all familiar. And you can compare that to the 6% that was in fact extremely familiar. And the rest was slightly familiar to somewhat familiar, indicating that they are not sure about exactly what is entailed in relation to the political system that we had. And perhaps that is precisely why they were not in a position to give us a concrete response as to what is the likely implications stemming from the transition from a monarchical system of government to a Republican system of government. If you don't know the system, then you're in a position where you may not be able to think through very coherently about what would be the implications in a very concrete way for the country. But we also asked them about the Republican system of government. And what we found is that there were almost 3 times as many persons were unfamiliar with what a Republican system of government is all about when compared to, of course, the monarchical system of government. Again, we saw that a significant percentage of the population indicated that they were slightly familiar, somewhat familiar, and to a very low 3% who indicated that they were in fact extremely familiar with a Republican system of government. Yet we are making people are making a lot of assumptions, a lot of judgments about both political systems, when it is quite clear that there is a knowledge gap in relation to how the two systems operate and what they are in fact all about. Now, we sort of did the cross, checking. We looked at the sex, the age, and level of education in relation to the familiarity of political systems. And what we found is that in relation to sex, that females were 54% more likely to be unfamiliar with the constitutional monarchy compared to males at 46%. So there's a slight gap between the two. In terms of age, again, youngest of the respondents between the ages of 18 to 24, some 34% of them were more unfamiliar with the system compared to the older respondents, where there was a 20% unfamiliarity. And those with secondary and lower level education, some 39% of them were more unfamiliar with the system compared with the more educated, where only 15% showed that they were unfamiliar with, of course, the constitutional monarchy. We asked the same, we did the same sort of analysis, cross-checking in relation to Republican system. And the data is more or less the same, with 57% of females being more unfamiliar with the Republican system compared to 43% of males. In terms of the age demographics, again, the younger population, 24%. So they're even less familiar with a Republican system than they are with the constitutional monarchy, some 24% compared to the older population of 15%. And in relation to education level, again, that is something which is consistent throughout the questionnaire. What we see is that those with secondary and lower education, some 34% of them were more unfamiliar with this system, that is the Republican system, compared to those who had a greater or higher levels of education, either the post-secondary, tertiary university type education, and it's a 14%. So education is clearly a very strong predictor as to whether or not people are familiar with the political systems. Go ahead. Next slide. So what can we say about sex and political awareness then? What is very clear to us is that there is a low level of political knowledge and political literacy across. So we found that whereas men were more politically aware than women, we found that men were more politically aware than women of the various political systems. And that is in fact entirely consistent with what the literature is saying about women and political efficacy and political awareness. Now, the analysis of public opinion polls, generally speaking, has shown that large numbers of citizens cannot answer basic facts about their own political system. This is not something that is unique to countries that operate a constitutional monarchy. We see that in the United States, for instance. Americans, for instance, are very unaware of important functions and structures in relation to their own political system. And therefore, what we are seeing in relation to the Caribbean, in relation to Barbados, is entirely consistent with what the literature is saying to us. Many persons, which is what the literature is saying, struggle to effectively connect their preferences. And this is what we saw in relation to the pros and the cons. When we asked them to identify, they couldn't. So they're struggling to effectively connect their preferences to specific policy choices or even to party platforms. That is what the literature is saying to us. And in relation to this survey, we are seeing it coming out very clearly. So what we said, as I indicated a while ago, is that many of the respondents, and we've seen that in the responses that we got, many of them tend to provide on-the-fly responses as opposed to well-reasoned responses. We also, in terms of literature, we also have been told that, again, what we get is a situation where we are clearly witness male domination and participation in public affairs. That is usually encouraged. That has in fact been the norm. And so men tend to, it is argued, watch news items, they read and listen to news far more frequently than in fact women. And therefore it is not entirely surprising that men are men are more aware, although the gap is not a large gap, but it is not entirely surprising that men are more aware of those things. Of course, we know that women are largely responsible for, the family and household. And sometimes that, in a sense, rob women of the opportunity to do some of the things that men are doing. And therefore, they do not have the level of public engagement, public activity men do have. And that may explain the divide that we see in terms of the data that is coming out of the poll that we just conducted. Now, when we asked the respondents about what kind of a republic they would like to see in Barbados. So what we asked them specifically, when Barbados becomes a republic, we know Barbados is a republic, but this was done in November before the transition to republic, with its own head and president instead of the Queen and of course the Governor General acting as the head of state. In what ways would they prefer to see the head or the president chosen. That is, we ask them how they would like to see the president chosen. We know that in relation to the decision of Barbados government, it was decided that Parliament would choose 2/3 majority, and that is how, of course, the president would be elected. So we did ask. I think the decision already had been made in Barbados that would be Parliament ultimately would make that decision. And what we see is very clear. The majority of Barbadians, not the relative majority, that's majority of Barbadians, some almost 53% of those of the sample population opted for the head of state of Barbados to be directly elected by the people. So they're asking for some kind of public participation in the selection of the president. What I also found interesting, if you look at that slide, I find very interesting, is that the Barbadians that we polled, and is a representative sample of Barbadians, a mere 13%, a little under 14%, supported the proposal of the Barbados government in a sense that Parliament should ultimately be responsible for selecting or electing the president of Barbados. We asked further beyond just looking at Parliament. So we're talking about a joint, both the Senate and the House of Assembly, because that is the Parliament. We then asked them whether or not they would prefer if the president would be selected by the lower house, which is the House of Assembly or the House of Representatives. And only 8% of the sample population opted for that. And that is, almost twice as high as that, for the president being selected merely by the appointed chief. What I find interesting, however, is that notwithstanding the fact that there are people who are concerned about the overwhelming presence of the prime minister, I'm not talking about this prime minister, but any prime minister in selection process, what we see is that quite apart from Barbadians opting for the president to be elected directly by the people, the persons also felt that the prime minister and the leader of the opposition, well, the prime minister should, failing public participation, then it should in fact fall to the prime minister to that appointment. And they opted for that over and above being elected by the Parliament, which is the process or the method which was chosen by the Barbados government. So I found that to be an interesting, it's low, it's just under 16%, so it is quite low, but nonetheless, they have opted for that instead of elected by the Parliament, which most people think would be more democratic than just merely allowing the prime minister to select the individual. All right, move on. Next slide, please. All right, now we asked them about the decision of the Barbados government again to have its own head of state and what would be their preference in relation to whether or not there is in fact a ceremonial president similar to what you have in Dominica or Trinidad and Tobago, or whether or not Barbados should opt for an executive president. So the question was whether or not there should be a ceremonial president, a non-executive president, or executive president. And what we see is that a relative majority, that is 36% of those we opted for, we polled, opted for a ceremonial president, that is a non-executive president. It's quite interesting because recall that an absolute majority of them also felt that this non-executive president should actually be elected by the people. And I'm not sure to what extent people have given serious consideration to the implications of that. And that's not to say, of course, that we have not seen political systems where, of course, the head of state is popularly elected, but the head of state also enjoys a ceremonial position in terms of the political system. But again, I'm not sure that people have thought through their preferences very carefully. Next slide, please. Now, one question which I think the audience may be interested in is on the issue of the referendum. And we know that in Barbados, that was quite controversial. There are a number of people who call for a referendum. We know, of course, the Barbados Constitution does not require for a referendum to, in fact, transit a republic. But nonetheless, we asked that question, and what we see is that a relative majority of the population felt that there should have been a referendum. Some 46% of the population compared to 30% of the population who felt that, Barbados, there was no need for Barbados to have a referendum. Go on, please. Next slide. All right, so I want to conclude in relation to the findings. And what I would say is that we have not detected any great divide on the issue of whether Barbados should retain or should have retained the monarchy or become the monarchical system or become a republic. To me, it is far from that, what the results are showing. Those who supported the transition outnumbered those that was supportive of the status quo, with that support actually being strongest among the more educated and older citizens of Barbados. The majority of Barbadians supported the transition to republic. When we factored in those for whom either status was acceptable. Simply put, what we are arguing is that even when we discounted the latter category, that is those who, for them, it was neither here nor there, what we see is that those favoring the transition outnumbered those in support of the status quo almost 2 to 1. And so there is little evidence, we arguing, of any powerful or meaningful attachment to the crown in Barbados at this point in time. What, however, remains clear in terms of the data that we have is that there is a definitive information gap or knowledge gap, and that gap may have impacted the perception of the transition in Barbados. Respondents, we believe, were quite simply not well informed. And as Professor Devonish explained, there is no real enthusiasm. There's no real enthusiasm for the monarchy in Barbados. Interestingly, too, the survey also showed that a very high percentage of Barbadians would prefer a directly elected head of state to one appointed by the joint houses of parliament or either house of parliament. And I think that is quite instructive. Based on some of the responses that we received, we are not convinced that there's any deep consideration, has in fact been given to the issue of the potential risk involved in what may quite possibly be opening up the system to the politicization of the highest office, whether the president is elected or appointed. Furthermore, and finally, we find that Barbadians are more in favor of the PM, as I indicated a while ago, selecting the head of state than parliament itself, which to me is indicative of distrust and general cynicism of parliament. So that going forward, we are saying that 2 questions must be asked. Have we sufficiently focused on citizens' competence, on having an informed citizenry? How can citizens better understand public debate and make sophisticated decisions among important matters? So what we are proposing, and that is something that others have done already, is that clearly going forward, what is required is greater public information, education and engagement on further changes, reforms, which are related specifically to constitutional and legal changes. I think Dwayne is in a position where he may be able to also provide you with some of the suggestions that Barbadians were making in relation to what they would like to see in the future, not necessarily in relation to constitutionally to what we have discussed, but certainly what they would like to see, which is not captured in terms of the slides. And I want to thank you. Those of you who have remained with us, thank you for staying the course. Cleve, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles, Professor of Constitutional Governance and Politics, and Professor Devonish, Professor of Management and Organizational Behavior. I recognize that we have several colleagues from the Cable campus, and I welcome them. In particular, I noticed that we have here Dr. Halima Dishong. Good evening, Dr. Dishong. Nice to have you. We know you're busy in New York, so we hope you're on vacation and joining us. So it's time for questions. Do we have any questions?
Or comments.
Okay, or comments. So who's going to go first? We have Steve. Steve, do I need to unmute your mic, or you can do it? I need to ask.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to, thanks very much. That was it's a really important piece of work. I think you've done really well there. Now, that was very impressive. One question, your use of the question about, do you think the monarchy is important? And I thought, coming from England, I recognise in England that the monarchy is important because it exists, because it controls so much. But I'm a Republican. I don't want, and part of the reason I'm a Republican is because I don't want the monarchy to be important. I want it to be unimportant. So I wonder if there might have been some confusion, perhaps, in the minds of what you meant in that question. And the second thing that occurred to me, when you talked about the older participants, I wonder if the fact that older people had been born under colonial government or shortly afterwards, and therefore might have a more hostile attitude for those younger, compared to those younger people for whom it could well be a distant memory that maybe their grandparents have spoken of, but doesn't really figure quite so highly in their lives. Just those two. Thank you.
Dwayne, you want to go, or would you like me to go first? I can.
You can go first, Cynthia.
Okay, I can respond to the former. I can respond to the latter part of the question. Thank you, Steve. I think these are great questions, actually. In relation to older Barbadians, I would like to think that in relation to Barbados, that clearly the older population would have been more aware of some of the negatives of colonialism. They would have enjoyed it. They have also been around at the time when Barbados was moving towards independence in 1966. Some of them were alive, many of them were alive in 1966. And therefore, partly arising out of that transition to independence in Barbados in 1966, they would therefore be in a position where they may in fact question the continuing role of the Queen in our political order, which is very different to how young people who are not familiar with that, not familiar with some of the debate which has taken place, may feel. And therefore, I would agree with you that perhaps the experiences with not only colonialism, some of them are much older than 65, but certainly I think coming out of the concrete experiences of the 1966 project, it certainly would have impacted the perception of the Queen and the role and the role of the monarchy in Barbados specifically.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Cynthia Barrow-Giles. We recognize Dr. Deschamps. Please go ahead.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for this presentation and for this research. I really enjoyed listening and to the reflections from the survey. And I just was wondering about that finding towards the end that you discussed, Professor Barrow-Giles, in relation to showing the knowledge gaps that exist among people about republicanism, about the different political systems, because it keeps coming up all the time about the extent to which referendum in Barbados is necessary, and how these findings sort of places that in context that you could have a referendum in a population who might not be so aware about the different political systems, and how that might kind of obscure the outcome in relation to republicanism. And I'm thinking about this especially in relation to the attempts at constitutional reform in other Caribbean countries where referenda was used and they were unsuccessful. So I think sometimes we have to place in context. I think this research is so very important to locate the discussion about referendum and the extent to which it may be a useful tool or not, as Barbados make some further changes. Now they're drilling down to constitutional reform. So I wish more people could hear this and more people could actually hear what some of the educational gaps might be. And the recommendations you made at the end, I think would be very, very important going forward in terms of having a more educated and connected population to some of the key issues. Because when you read out that finding that you have a majority of people wanting an elected president, whether ceremonial or not. But at the same time, You have them feeling comfortable about the president being selected by the prime minister only, as opposed to parliament, that becomes a preference. It tells us something about the knowledge gaps about our political system. So to me, that was very useful, especially given a lot of the conversations we've been having about the utility of a referendum. Thank you very much. And I really enjoyed the presentations all around.
Thank you, Halima.
Thank you.
Any feedback from either discussants? No?
Not really. Dwayne, you want to go or you wish me to go?
No, I agree with Halima. I mean, one would have to question the utility of a referendum in light of the mass ignorance of the populace with respect to the political systems.
And ignorance used in a good way, not a bad
well,
way.
ignorance, of course, the lack of awareness in that sense. And so we have to be careful of that. I think one of the key recommendations that you made, Cynthia, about the improvement of the public awareness and education is a necessity for any referendum, because if a referendum is as Halima highlighted is to be used, its utility has to be hinged on the public education or the level of awareness and education that the public has with respect to these political systems. We've seen a lot of dangers where referenda have been installed and they haven't passed, and for a large percentage of those that have failed, it was really occasioned by the tremendous amount of unfamiliarity of the populace with respect to political systems. I just want to make a point though quickly. When you look at this in 1999 in Australia, where the referendum actually failed when it came to the move to republic, people were so, they didn't understand. And then when you delve deeper into it, okay, we had these recent polls in Australia in 1998, for example, where people were really gung-ho about the Republican move. But here you had a referendum. But if you look at it, it was the question that was asked. Because if you remember in 1999, when that question was asked in Australia of the people about whether they wanted Australia to move to a republic, the question really was more nuanced. It was about and that not just moving to a republic, but that the head of state was to be appointed by Parliament. And there was a split in the pro-Republican base, because even though they were gung-ho about being a Republican, and that was in Australia, they were not on the same side as other pro-Republican supporters about the nature of how that selection of the head of state for Australia would have be undergone, and that's interesting. So when we think about referendum, we also have to look at the detail. What question are we going to ask? Are we going to ask just simply Barbados move into a republic, or should we add in the nuance of how that head of state should be selected? Because in Australia, that was sufficient to kind of allow the referendum to actually fail. It didn't pass, because of the people were split even on the pro-Republican side, that we want Republican, but we don't want it to be selected this way. We don't want the head of state, to be selected in this manner. And more Australians were really for directly elected head of state. That was what their call was. So in fact, what had happened in the Australian referendum during that period was that you had this split in the Republican support base that says that, it's better that this referendum failed, so that at least we are able to kind of modify in a few years' time the question that we want, that whether that head of state should be selected directly from the people. So we also want to look at that, I think, in more detail. So
yes,
thank you.
Yes, thanks. Yes, I think, Halima, for your own country, in 2009, when there was the question of the constitutional reform and the constitutional reform was put to a referendum in St. Vincent, they also came across particular difficulties, which I think that Cleve is in a better position to speak on. So Cleve, if you do not mind, perhaps you can address the feelings of that 2009 referenda in St. Vincent.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Barrow-Giles. Just to add, for the sake of the listeners and viewers, we need to go back to the 1960s and constitutional makings across the region in Britain and Whitehall. The fact that these constitutions were entrenched was a reflection of the mistrust of the potential governors. Governance at the time, not governors, governance. Remember the Eric Garys and the E.T. Joshuas and in the Leeward Islands. So that if you take Barbados, Barbados was always considered to be the more educated, the more competent. But in the terms of the St. Vincent situation, the commingling of all these various components made it very difficult for persons to take the good and leave out the bad. That's my assessment, and I think many other analysts share my assessment that by and large, I think Vincentians wanted to move to the Republicanism as we saw in the Barbados survey. But just to indicate as well, Professor Barrow-Giles, that we are going to do a similar survey in 9 more countries. I can't remember the 9 countries.
More than 9.
More than 9, right? We're going to do that as part of the wider project. And what we are hearing is perhaps we probably need to drill down some more, Professor Devonish, in some of the aspects to try to understand the psyche a bit more. And I think that when we go to the Windward and Leeward, we'll have to do that. I'm particularly note that your socioeconomic status analysis is reflective of how we know the Barbadian landscape, cultural scape is. But when we go to the Windward and Leewards, we're going to find perhaps a more disparity, and hence we need to drill. Do we have any other questions so far or comments?
I'm not sure about the disparities that you speak of, but Cleve, just to be clear, it's very difficult for you to, pile on more questions upon questions in a poll like this. And again, remember, there are also cost considerations. So being very careful in relation to the questions that we're asking. Would I like the question to be more extensive, but that implies a whole host of other things as well. We are mindful of the fact that as we go across the Caribbean, particularly as we deal with the non-independent countries, the bots, like Bermuda and I can't remember if Montserrat right now is one of the countries we'll be certainly surveying. But as we move down the island chains, we will be making some modifications to our questioning, given the particular context within which the survey will be conducted in the specific country.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions or comments?
Perhaps you can ask Kate then to, sorry.
There's one by Paul Ward in the chat, and he's just switched on his camera.
Paul Ward.
Yeah, hi. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I did just post the same question in the chat. And I wrote this. Given the general lack of political knowledge amongst the people surveyed, perhaps a good question would have been, how important is government in general to the lives of people in Barbados? And I asked that because one of the slides showed that 65% of respondents thought that any change would be neutral. I think that relates to the fact that a lot of people don't really see the importance of government anyway. In other words, the lack of interest or the lack of knowledge that goes with the lack of interest may be related to that.
Yes, I spoke to the issue of cynicism, and I did say the cynicism in Parliament, but perhaps I should say the cynicism in governments and politicians, generally speaking. Yes?
Yeah, sure. Okay, thanks if I missed that.
Well, thank you very much. Questions, comments?
Cleve, maybe we can ask Kate to just kind of wrap up. She's representing the main investigator here today, the principal investigator.
For those of you who came in late, we have with us Assistant Professor of History at the University College of London, the Institute of the Americas, Professor Kate Quinn. Kate?
Hi, thank you. You're promoting me. I'm Dr. Kate Quinn. I'm not quite professor yet, but thank you for the promotion. I just wanted to add really that how interested I was to hear these findings, and I guess coming from somewhere where we did have a referendum on a matter of great constitutional import here in 2016, without any form of real, genuinely neutral public education campaign, and one that became extremely polarized and fractious down various partisan lines. That the key takeaway from this, I think, is the need for meaningful public engagement and education campaigns for with any constitutional reform moving forward. So yes, I'm looking forward to seeing how do the poll findings pan out across the Caribbean, and what kind of lessons we might learn from that, both over here at the UK end and at the Caribbean end, because one of the features of the reporting on Barbados's move to Republican status from the UK perspective is also how ignorant people in the UK are about this history of the relationship, well, the colonial relationship with the Caribbean. No idea for many people that the Queen is the head of state in all of these other countries outside of the UK. A great deal of ignorance about the process by which Barbados moved to republic status. Sadly, I think that when I look at the findings from this poll, I think that the kind of finding that the UK media is most likely to pick up on is that Prince Harry is 3 times more popular than Prince William. And what does this mean? There's a kind of obvious tabloidification of things over here, and I guess that'll be the finding that they'll pick up on. But it's all been fascinating. So I'm just looking forward to seeing how the research progresses.
So thank you very much, Kate. For the information of all listening and viewing, you can visit the project website. It's thevisiblecrong.com, and it's a collaboration between the University College of London, City University, and the University of the West Indies, both Cleve campus and Mona campus, through the University Museum there at Mona, Jamaica.
And Southampton, I should mention, Southampton and University of London.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that's it. No more questions. We will have more sessions in the future. Just keep checking us. And if you have any other questions you wish to send, you can email us using the website that I mentioned. Thank you very much, and bye-bye. From Kingston, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and from Barbados, and from London.
Thank you, Kate, for staying for us. I know it's late into the night, so thank you very much.
That's okay. Thanks. It's been great to be here.
Bye, people. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, our audience.
All right.
Dwayne, you want to stay on?
Yeah, I'll stay on.
Leave, and has Kate gone?
Let's see.
Seem to have gone.